Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. Fabio, thank you very much for joining The No Show. I'm really pleased to have you. And your research is really, really interesting. But before we get into that, could you sort of introduce yourself to the audience and give a bit of a background about yourself?
Okay. Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Fabio Petito. I teach international relations at the University of Sussex, close to Brighton. I'm an Italian scholar who came to the United Kingdom and stayed there. At the moment, I'm a post-Brexit Italian-British citizen, I would say. And that's really as a general kind of introduction.
Excellent. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. So tell me a bit about sort of how did you sort of find yourself studying the sort of interaction between religion and politics?
Okay, that's a very good question. I mean, the way in which all this started was really when I was doing my undergraduate university and exploring different sort of social sciences, from economics to politics to international relations. And I really, at that point, was hugely struck. It was after the end of the Cold War by this intervention by the very well-known Harvard-based political scientist Samuel Huntington, which in 1993 wrote this very popular paper on the clash of civilizations. And of course, that spoke a lot to me because according to Huntington, one of the future fault line of the forthcoming clash of civilization was the Mediterranean Sea, this border where the Western European civilization was meeting the Islamic world. And what struck to me was that this was the sea of where I was born. I come from southern Italy, from the city of Naples. And this is the sea that I have always loved and watched. And I had always thought that this was actually a sea of encounters, a sea that shared so much more in terms of a common way of life between the northern and the southern shore. I knew that my city, yes, was a southern European city, but had so much to share with Rabat, Marrakesh, Istanbul, the southern shore of the Mediterranean. So really this idea that this was a fault line of geopolitical confrontation and not a common world and a civilization, as I had thought, the Mediterranean civilization really spoke very strongly to me. So from there, I start to engage with this idea of trying to think where Huntington had got it wrong. And the more I was studying, I start to realize that it was really about the way in which politics and international politics had been changing. And the fact that the big elephant in the room was this issue of religion, and how religion was reassuming a different role in politics after the end of the Cold War. And so that was the starting point. And then, I tried to study and research this field, and I simply realized, well, actually, nobody's writing about that. Everybody's neglecting. And the only thing that I could really find was the idea that, religions belong to the past. We are becoming more and more modern, and the secularization is the common destiny of the humanity. That was the common predominant paradigm, really, that you could find most social sciences in the 20th century, including international relations. And that was the starting point for me. Of course, the Huntingtonian moment was pointing to a change, and there were other experts and scholars which intervened and said, well, there is a bad news here. Religion is back to the center stage of world politics, and that's not a good news. So books were written by people like Gilles Kepel, who wrote The Revenge of God, or Mark Hugensmeyer, Terror in the Minds of God. So I was faced with these two options. Either we believe that religion belongs only to the past, or if it belongs to the present, it belongs just to this inescapable set of problems: instability, wars, terrorism, fundamentalism. And I thought this was very problematic. And clearly there was so much more about religion and the way in which it was playing and shaping international politics, and also the way in which religion could contribute to global politics. And that was in some way my starting point.
That's a fascinating starting point, because it's kind of like you were being told what you should think, or how you should sort of perceive these sort of opposing civilizations, when you're from sort of the heart of it, the heart of what he was discussing. And the problem for me from that story is that you responded in sort of trying to find out where he got it wrong because you're from there. But imagine everybody else, that like many, hundreds, if not thousands of people who read his work, who, just took it at face value. Does the rhetoric of people like him who write these papers, does that shape the way we think about politics?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's well known that the intervention of Huntington has been one of the most influential pieces, not only of writing on international relations, but it has been hugely influential in shaping the way in which policymakers, governments, and other actors have been seeing politics. In some way, I think, even actors that really you don't expect, let's say Daesh. I think Daesh, they really have a kind of Huntingtonian framework of looking at the world and the opposition between, for example, Islam and the West. And of course, it's interesting because, for example, the context of the war on terror after the war in Iraq and the Bush administration way of framing this conflict, really many argued was shaped by the Huntingtonian framework. Even if I have to say that as I studied more this topic, I realized that the thesis of Huntington took a life of its own, well beyond also the initial intentions and approach of Huntington himself. For example, I give you an example that is not often pointed. Huntington was one of the strong establishment people who criticized the war in Iraq in the US, which is quite counter. But why? Because he said, we need to be careful. There is this danger that we end up, and that was his point, into this clash of civilization. And one of the key routes to that is when the West intervene in other spheres of civilization, trying to impose its own models. And I think in this respect, he had an important point to make. And that's why he said, this intervention in Iraq will only lead to further problems. Anyway, in some way, he was absolutely right about that. So just to say that, there is this, but Em said that you are absolutely right. It was an extremely influential piece. And on the broader scale of things, I would say not in a positive kind of way, for the many reasons that you were pointing to. Even if, as I said, scholarly speaking, there are some interesting insights there that actually, by studying and working on that, I've learned to reevaluate.
And that's, it's fascinating to see sort of how how somebody's influential piece, how the person who sort of writes this work can perceive things completely different to those who act on his work, which is counterintuitive, but also is telling of politics as well. So politics is.
I'll give you another example, which is fascinating about that, and it's from the opposite political and theoretical perspective. The great Palestinian scholar Edward Said, which has written one of the most influential and beautiful interventions, Orientalism, exactly arguing how much the problem with the way in which the West has perceived the Near East and the Islamic world has been this sort of construction of Islam in a way that actually, in his view, was reinforcing the domination and colonialism of the Europe over that region. No? And so the creation of a series of stereotypes and that made Islam irrational, while Europe was rational, or Islam the Middle East unstable, vis-a-vis authoritarian, democratic, all these dichotomies, the self and other. No, very important intervention in the debates over also post-colonial developments. Now, of course, Said made this argument. Said was a Palestinian, was someone from the region, had been educated in Egypt, happened to be a Christian Palestinian, but was also very secular in his outlook. What happens when the new Islamic movements start to use his book as a symbol in many ways of their struggle? He was very disturbed. He said, "I never intended to my ideas, to be carried by these that he believed were nativist and regressive movements." He was so committed to a form of secular, progressive, leftist kind of politics of justice. But actually, his book was hugely influential in shaping the way in which many radical Islamist movements were seeing the politics in that context. So just to give you another example of how sometimes actually ideas, they take a life and a journey that is very unpredictable and sometimes very much against the intentions of the author.
It's amazing. It's amazing, especially in the context of religion, because like you said, there was this idea that we're going to move towards secularism and humanity would be sort of saved by secularism and this rationale. But I think I want to sort of shoot that idea down, and with your help, by sort of shedding the light on how religion, regardless of religion, but religion has played a really important part in stability in some places and improvement of people's lives and just the overall well-being. What are the sort of positive religious political examples?
Well, I think, let's start first of all. I think for many decades, and especially in the 20th century, we had this predominant paradigm of modernization, which argued that all society in a relatively similar way will move from a traditional setting to a modern setting. And that implied a number of different things, which might have been, the processes of urbanization, process of industrialization. And another crucial dimension was that this society will become more secular. So the secularization thesis was a sort of corollary of the modernization thesis. And it was based on this idea that, traditional society are linked to religion, and there's some way it is religion itself which is an obstacle to modernization and therefore needs to be removed. Now, we now know that the situation is that this was more about ideology than historical developments. it is a set of ideas which are coming very specifically from developments that were European developments, the Enlightenment, the strong fight between religion and the state in Europe, religion and church. So these are not historical truths. They are coming from a very specific history, which is a European history. And in some way, also, if you think about that European history, for example, you asked me for the positive contribution. Let me give you just one that gives you the idea. Let's say nobody will deny that the worst authoritarian dictatorial experiences in the 20th century politics have been Europeans. I'm thinking here of Nazism and fascism, just to mention two. Let's say Italy and Germany, two countries I know well. However, after the defeat in the World War II, were able to have remarkable transition to democracy from coming two of the most authoritarian dictatorial regime to democracy. And that was possible, actually, thanks to what are known Christian democratic parties. So, people that were inspired genuinely by their faith, that lived through the difficulties of that time, and which rethought and reorganized the idea of democracy and combined it also with their own beliefs, and were able to give these two countries successful democratic transition. Yeah, this is, just to give you a very European example to show that, yes, religion can have a positive impact even in so-called secularized Europe in the 20th century, secular century. But there are so many more examples in the world. I think, if you look at the most poor part of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, and you look at the main challenges that this part of the world face, like sanitation and poverty and education. Who are the actors there that are trying to improve health with local clinics? They are very often religious actors, either in the mosque or in the churches or in the temples. There is an health clinic. Who is providing education for the kids in the most desperate and poor, marginalized parts of the world where the state doesn't reach because it doesn't have the capacity? Well, our local community and very often a faith-based organization around the local community. So, religion is so central to really existing community and their life and the fabrics of society. And of course, because it is so important, it can be politically ambivalent. It can be mobilized for conflicts, antagonism, but it can also be mobilized for progress, development, peace building, reconciliation. For me, this notion is very important. Religion is politically ambivalent. Mm-hmm. And that's why I really reject this biased view that sees religion as inescapably linked to violence, instability, and terrorism. And this was a very strong view that emerged after the end of the Cold War in the Huntingtonian moment. And I think I a little bit contributed to the second stage of scholarship, which rejected this reading of religion and politics in international relations and suggested exactly that we need to move from the assumption that religion is politically ambivalent. Of course, it can promote conflict, terrorism, instability, but it can also contribute to peace building, reconciliation, human rights advocacy, sustainable development. And now the important question becomes then, under which condition religion does contribute to one or to the other, or which kind of religion or which kind of religiosity is more prone to peaceful or non-violent political strategy, and which kind of religiosity is more prone to religious-inspired political violence, for example. This becomes the crucial social scientific, we could say, kind of question for me.
That's a very sort of interesting question, and it's a question that is also, I suppose, would become very uncomfortable for a lot of people to sort of, a lot of academics to shy away from because of its sort of prickly nature. Um, but fundamentally it has to be answered, and or it has to be at least addressed in some way. Um, and I mean, in that regard, has there been movements in that direction to sort of look at which type of religiosity is more inclined in a particular way?
Yes, I think this is you're very right in saying that there is a degree of feeling uncomfortable about this question, because, we don't need to forget one of the reasons why this issue of religion was either neglected or looked in a very dismissive, negative way, had to do with the fact of the kind of mindset that most academics, in particular in the Western world, were bringing with themselves to the topic. So, and that shows in the fact that, just to give an example, 10 years ago in the United Kingdom, there was not even one module offered in university looking at the role of religions and international politics. Mine was one of the first. Then now the situation has changed significantly, okay? But just to give you this idea, there is something really that has been putting, unfortunately, religion in a kind of strange place in the academia. Now, your question, which is crucial, about what kind of religion or religiosity seems to be more associated to violence and vice versa, to non-violence political behavior. First of all, I would say, and that's an assumption, I can give you some evidence about that, but I cannot prove it. My assumption is that in all the great worldwide religious traditions, and so I'm referring to the religious traditions which have sustained their development over centuries and they are globals and so on, I think you can find evidence of the full spectrum of what in Western language we will say political position, from the non-violent peace activist to the violent terrorist. That applies to Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. Okay, so I don't think there is anything religious specific that can say one religion is more violent or more peace prone than another. Let me give you the example. We had in the West this idea of a peace-loving Buddhism, meditation, especially in the last postmodern age. This was where, and look what's going on with Buddhist nationalism in Southeast Asia at the moment, in the last 5 years, with Buddhist monks leading in Myanmar, for example, what is called a genocide against the Rohingya Muslims. Just to give you an example, but as I said, this can be said for every religion. Now, however, I think now we know more, especially thanks to the work done in the last decades around religious extremism. Actually, we know now much more about the kind of religiosity of the religious extremists. And you know what? We have found out that the kind of assumption we had were completely wrong. Because there was this implicit assumption that, a religious extremist is a very religious person, is a kind of holds a religious fundamentalist with a strong religious view. For him, religion is overwhelming. But then, now we know much more about, let's say, the people who have been, for example, from this country, going to Syria and joining Daesh. And, we knew that they were buying Islam for Dummies on Amazon before doing the trip. We know much more, for example, about the people of Al-Qaeda who struck 9/11. None of them had a very clear religious background. Most of them were Western kind of educated, born in bourgeois kind of families. They were most Saudis, but very Western oriented, the way they had been brought up. We know that, interesting, most of them were university educated, and you know what they did? Study a scientific discipline, medicine, engineers, very dangerous. Be always careful before studying this sort of stuff. But what we know is that at some point, and that applies also for other religions, but at some point, these people went through a sort of personal crisis. They met some radical preacher who told me, you need to come back to religion. But, I don't really know what religion is. I tell you, Islam is about you hate this, you don't like this, And so what we know now is that they are mostly religious illiterate people who are more, the kind of religiosity they have is very superficial, is very often not part of an intergenerational chain of transmission, is not linked to a community which has nurtured them. It's the result of a very quick religious conversion done very often in contact with the radical kind of preachers, and similar things can be found in Christian right evangelicals in the US, who, for example, go and committed, attack with weapons to anti-abortion clinics. Similar things you can find also with reference to Hindu nationalists. It's very, so what we have learned is that actually there is a sort of holy ignorance, which is the base of the more religious engagement, which is more inclined to violence. It is in the context where you have religious illiteracy. You don't know a lot about your own tradition, that it's much more easier that you take a sort of direction towards religious-inspired political violence. On the contrary, what we know now is that what we call religious peace building, that is, religious leaders, communities, actors engaged because of their faith in reconciliation across communities, mediation of conflict. These are people actually which we would call very religious literate, people which have been nurtured and in constant contact with their religious traditions, that therefore develop. So, this is a quite interesting developments in the sense that I think now we have a lot of empirical evidence that seems to suggest that the problem is not that we have too much religion, and that's the problem that is resulting in violence. The problem is that when there is not enough, if you allow me this word, religion, when there is not enough knowledge, when there is not enough literacy on the tradition, this is the context in which actually the political entrepreneur can come and manipulate the specific subject towards more violent religious behavior. Now, this is, I'm simplifying, the situations are very different, many different contexts, but this is an important theoretical point that I think we have learned from the last couple of decades experience on religious extremism.
So essentially, I mean, what you're saying, the general findings have been is that, extremism, radical extremism in religion come from a lack of religion as opposed to, an in-depth awareness of the religion.
Yes, you could put it like that. And it's interesting. What some sociologists have put it, you find in these religious extremists what they call doctrinally weak religion. So a sort of religion which is very a little rooted in the tradition. It's a mix up of number of slogans and general points, very mix and pick and mix. So it's a very doctrinally superficial kind of religion, to the point that Olivier Roy, which again was coming from not necessarily a religious sympathetic kind of analysis, came to write this book on the holy ignorance. Says actually that's the greatest danger, because the forms of extremism we see and fundamentalism we see is based on a sort of holy ignorance.
Well, this is really, really interesting. I mean, this is very powerful, and this is the kind of stuff that I'd love to sort of shed light on and sort of bring out to wider audiences. And I mean, just you speaking it sort of triggered lots of images in my mind. I mean, if you look at, the previous maybe 6 or 7, terrorist attacks in London, they were perpetrated by guys who, adopted Islam in prison. And again, doctrinally very weak, very, very shallow. And it speaks to this lack of religious awareness. And the thing that I wanted to sort of ask you was, given that, I'm sure these political players are very well aware of some of these themes or these ideas, how much have you seen, or how much do you think political players in Europe, in particular, Europe and the US, have leveraged this ignorance of people not knowing why people commit terrorist attacks, to then make them have a particular populist approach to the other?
Well, clearly, clearly, I think the way I would say it is that I think we are going through some major kind of ideological transformation. There are widespread crises of identity, collective identity in national communities. So clearly, also the emergence of populist politics speaks also to this sort of crisis. And of course, in Europe, this has been linked to very much to the issue of Islam and the growing presence of Islam in the public sphere. This has been, recurrent themes of the kind of populist movements, and clearly, they have been making electoral progress out of this sort of manipulation. What is also very interesting to me is that many of these movements, and also some of the intellectuals who have been, providing their ideas for this movement, also have sometimes manipulated Christianity on the grounds that we need to defend the Christian roots and Christian civilization. And then if you actually look and start to find out, you find again a sort of religious ignorance, in the sense they have argued this, for example, while they are not at all Christians. I mean, there are many of these so-called pious atheists, that have actually, and here you see how much, the mobilization of religion in the self-hather kind of opposition is crucial and can be dangerous. And, in some way, this is also what I personally believe Daesh has been doing in its last, even more recent attacks in Europe. It's not a coincidence that they have been in France, for example, targeting, Christian churches, because, of course, for this sort of extremist position, and I here use a kind of parallelism, between populist politics and the religious, the extremist movements like Daesh. The idea of creating a narrative which is of a religious clash and war is also what helps them thrive and succeed. So, and that's why I think actually that today religious leaders, religious organizations have a huge responsibility in challenging these narratives and actually providing new narratives of fraternity among the different religions. And, I'm mentioning this because I was extremely struck by the way in which, for example, last year, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Sheikh Al-Tayeb, met Pope Francis in Abu Dhabi to sign this declaration of human fraternity, which is extremely powerful and unprecedented, these two major leaders. But I think this is really so important in our current political situation, because, there are very serious forces and also trends which goes towards opposing different communities, different religious tradition. And I think also governments, they don't know much what to do. And when they act, actually they create more problem than others. I mean, I'm thinking about what the kind of reaction that the French government and Macron, frankly, had to the recent attack, terrible attacks. And I can understand some of the strong state stance that he wants to take. But what he's doing is completely counterproductive. This sort of discourse, we need to eliminate this separatist tendency of Islam in France, as if the Islamic community, which is an important community of millions of people in France, is a sort of separate bodies. We cannot. I mean, this is wrong. This is wrong way of approaching these issues, and will generate even more problems. So, I actually at the moment think that in this scenario, religious leaders do have a responsibility, because politicians, secular kind of organization, really are taking the wrong decisions. And the only one which seems to me are capable of seeing the dangers and perhaps to offer a new, different, more positive narratives can be religious leaders.
I mean, that really is something that I agree with 100%. And I mean, being from the Middle East myself, and being from Iraq especially, and having seen this stuff firsthand, it's quite clear that that these religious leaders have. It's a really complicated one, because you have like, for example, the main scholar of Iraq, who is Sistani, Sayyid Sistani.
Yes, sure.
And Sayyid Sistani has maintained from the very beginning that I am, not getting involved in politics. I'm just your spiritual guide, your spiritual leader. But then the problem is with that is it leaves so much room for interpretation within the political sphere, and that allows people to sort of manipulate people in whichever way they want. Because traditionally Iraq, I mean, go back maybe 1,000 years, Iraq has always been manipulated via religion and via these sort of narratives. So with respect to sort of religious leaders in general, what do you think their roles have become stronger over time, or they've been dimmed down?
No, look, thanks for the question, because I don't want to give the impression that I'm simply saying that religious leaders are by definition kind of peace builders. That's not the case. Of course, the same issue of ambivalence applies to them as much as political entrepreneurs. However, I would say that it's clear, and here allows me to give, it's clear that religious leaders have, in the last 50 years, becomes more central to the political dynamics of many different contexts, particularly in the global South. I mean, you're talking about Iraq. It's clear that a big change happened with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. That sent a shock wave through the international system, because it was unheard of that a revolution was basically led by an Islamic, a religious leader, Imam Khomeini. Now, and that was not understood by foreign policymakers, from scholars. That was a major event in this discussion over the role of religion in global politics. But then, of course, things have moved on. And I personally think that if you look at the contemporary situation and you try to look at the kind of moral authority that can speak with credibility about some of the common challenges we face, climate change, the growing inequalities. I can't think of any politician which has at the moment the state, this kind of state, but I'm surprised by the way in which someone like Pope Francis is listened, for example, all over the global south, across religious traditions. And I think that tells you something, that it's as if we have reached a sort of stalemate in the realm of more secular ideologies of the 20th century, which has, galvanized millions of people. And that therefore, in this postmodern condition, there is a resurgence of spirituality and religions, and religious leadership can play a different role. So, I was very impressed when a few years ago I attended a conference on, after the financial crisis, that was about, rethinking really the capitalist system in which we are living and the financialization of the system. So, and then it was a Muslim scholar who stood up and said, "Have you read the last encyclical of Pope Francis, Laudato Si"? That's a radical critique of the capitalist system and how it's unavoidable link to the environmental degradation and the ecological disaster. It was a revealing moment to me how, in some way, there is this, and I don't think in the West and also in secular academic circle, we realize that there is so much work and energy going on in these fields of interreligious collaboration, and many young, engaged citizens trying to think about, how to deal with the common challenges, are very much inspired by this sort of, engagement with their faith, their thinking about it. And I think in this respect, therefore, yes, religious leaders have a different role nowadays. It's also a responsibility, because of course that means that, things the challenge for them is to think about through the prism of common challenges, common problems. It's not about getting this as an opportunity to foster your own religious interest, your own. And that's a challenge, and of course, the other challenges have to do with many political, you mentioned Iraq. It's, of course, very complicated, as you know very well, because, clearly there is the Sunni-Shia divide, which was politicized over the Ba'athist era. And then, of course, now is politicized also by the growing role of Iran in the region. And you're right, Ali Sistani is very careful also in trying to differentiate his role vis-a-vis the Iranian, also because they belong to different schools and different. So, things, but that for me speaks to the other things, that when the United Kingdom, the Americans, they invaded Iraq, they had no idea at all of this sort of dynamics. And most of these boiled down also to their complete religious illiteracy as far as, these dynamics were concerned. And that's unfortunately generated so much devastating result. I remember in 2005 when one major terrorist attack by then Al-Qaeda in Iraq against the Golden Mosque in Baghdad. That was a turning point of the civil war. And for 1 year, the Americans, which at that moment, I think they had a couple of hundreds of soldiers and civilian and experts present in Iraq, they didn't understand at all, because they didn't understand how important these events was for the people because of the religious affiliation. They didn't get it. So that simply speaks, to the most amazing foreign policy failures of the most powerful foreign policy machines, the one of the US. And it speaks to to the huge problem of religious illiteracy in foreign policy, something that I was briefly referring to in our previous conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with that. Given that, you know, like there's this, you know, I mean, to a large extent, the Huntington example of the clash of civilization in the case of Iraq is valid, because essentially these guys came with a complete lack of awareness of the individual in Iraq and what moves them or what drives them. And it does ultimately lead to this sort of situation that you have in Iraq, or situations you have in other places where, you know, it's open, like it's, you know, it's a can of worms that's been lifted and nobody knows how to deal with it. There's not one single individual in the world that can give guidance on it, because it's something that's unprecedented. I mean, can we sort of briefly discuss Italy a bit, because Italy's had an interesting story, and so I wanna kind of, like, if you can just briefly sum up how religion in politics has evolved in Italy.
That's it. Well, of course, you know, the issue of religion and politics in modern Italy is a crucial link, because of the presence of the Vatican, the Holy See, therefore the Pope, which is a global religious leaders in the very territory of Italy, even if in a small independent microstate. Now, and so, you know, that actually speaks to the fact that, for example, even in the 20th century, European politics was never fully secular at all, and religions continue to play a huge role. And in fact, the fact that we believed that Europe had secularized and religion and the political spheres were separate was not the result of the transformation objectively on the ground, was the result of the transformation of the subject, the scholar, the expert, who was studying these things and was not anymore able to see these things because he had decided that it belonged to the past, and so they were not anymore there, but they were still there. Now, it's a very interesting story, because I think in Europe we need to understand that there were two very different trends that developed out of modernity. One were more, you could say, Catholic-oriented trend, and one more Protestant. And this affected the formation of states hugely, because basically, to cut a long story short, you had states which developed national churches, confessional churches, and they were more, they were Protestant kind of oriented, because like UK, Denmark, the Northern European states. And now this poses a series of different issues, questions for the way in which you link religion and politics. For example, you know, the question is much more about the institutions. For example, in the UK, you know, you have the head of state, which is also the head of the Anglican Church. I'm talking about the Queen. You have an institutional presence of the bishop of the Anglican Church within the House of Lords. So you have this sort, but at the same time, you know, you have also very strong non-discriminatory legislation, which has developed in the last decades, which guarantees a pretty high standard of freedom of religion or belief for the different religious communities. Now, in the Catholic world, the story is in Europe is a bit different. The Catholic Church was such a powerful political entity that there was a huge clash between the liberal nation state and the Catholic Church. So there was never this fusion that really was possible on an institutional level, because there was this clash. And the nation state, think of France, but also Italy, in order to affirm itself as a state, had to oppose and destroy in some way reduce the power of the church. And so what you have the emergence of different models. One is the French model of secularism, laicite, which was constructed as an opposition against the church. So laicite was basically a system whose origin was about reducing the power of the state, of the church in France, then was developed in a more sophisticated way as a law that will guarantee the rights also of all religious minorities and other beliefs. Now, in Italy, interestingly enough, you had this clash which happened in the liberal era at the end of the 19th century. You had this clash which was reinforced during fascism. And then you have this compromise in which basically the church plays an important role, but as a sort of source of ideas and cultural hegemony. So indirectly through politicians which are Catholics and which are inspired by the teaching of the church, we become engaged, and therefore these links is filtered through it's not a direct kind of influence, but filtered through this idea. But also the issue is that for Italy, the Catholic Church remains a global and very unique religion. It's the only one which is very hierarchical, with one religious leader and as a kind of global network which reach all over the world. So the Catholic Church will never want it to be reduced to Italian politics. That's, yes, relevant, they have a stake, but this is in some way too limiting. However, in my research and lately, I've tried to show how Rome in the last couple of decades has become a very interesting hub of interreligious connection, not all of Catholics, because the presence in Rome of the Pope is creating the condition also for many other religions to see this an important place of dialogue, engagement in the interreligious framework. And so it's becoming this concentration of religious knowledge, which I thought Italian diplomats, if they were interested in having good information, for example, about what to do in Iraq or in the Middle East, they should take advantage of, because I can assure you, the Catholic Church has much more knowledge about the reality, let's say even in Muslim majority countries, because they have still communities, priests, people who live there, than any governments, which simply, they haven't a clue many times of the real life social dynamics going on in this country. So that's why, as part of this idea that I think there is a very important need to improve religious knowledge, to understand the dynamics of society in the global south, I thought that actually this hub could be an asset for foreign policy makers wanting to interact with specific part of the world. So that's why indirectly my interest about the Catholic Church and what I call this possibly Italian model of religious engagement in foreign policy was one of my articles I published a few years ago.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. And it's mind blowing that the sort of capacity that the Vatican has in terms of potentially being able to leverage these inter-religious relationships to further let's call it political agendas in other places. Where can people find you online?
Well, online you can find me at the Sussex University website, and I run also a website which is called the Freedom of Religion or Belief and Foreign Policy Initiative, which is has its own website where I concentrate my more policy-oriented work around this pressing issue of how to protect and promote these important human rights of freedom of religion or belief. And then I also continue my work in Italy, where I had a research program based on one of the major Italian think tank, ISPI, the Italian Institute for Political Studies. And there I have more work which looks at this idea of religious engagement. And now diplomats, foreign policymakers need to build capacity to be able to engage religious actors more on the ground to achieve common policy objectives from peace, development, human rights. And just to mention, because I think it's very interesting, I just yesterday ran a forum within the largest Mediterranean conference run by states, which takes place every year in Rome. It's called Rome Med Dialogue. That was the 6th edition. And we had a religions forum embedded just after a number of prime ministers from the Mediterranean area intervened. Of course, everything virtual at the moment. But on my panel, there was also the Iraqi minister of culture minister, the minister of culture of Iraq. Very, very, very interesting man, which I strongly, he was the holder of the UNESCO interfaith chair in Iraq. Okay. Very, very, very distinguished guy. But we looked at the issue of human fraternity and inclusive citizenship, how religious leaders actually can contribute to build these sort of things in the Mediterranean. It was extremely successful dialogue. There is the YouTube 2 hours video online, which is getting a lot of attention. And I'm really excited because there was the feeling, here, maybe, here, these people maybe have something to offer more than politicians. And I thought it was very
please share these links with me so I can share them across all our platforms.
I will, with great pleasure.
Are you on Twitter by any chance?
Yes, I am on Twitter. My Twitter account is, I think, Petito_F.
Petito. I'll link it on. It will be on the video anyway.
Okay.
Okay. Excellent. Great. Well, Fabio, it was a pleasure speaking with you, and I'm sure I'm going to have to sort of pester you again to come on the show again because there's so much more I wanted to speak about.
I'll be delighted. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Said.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram @TheNoShowPod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.